You're lying in bed, running that calculation almost everyone has run at least once in their life. If I had $1 million, I'd be set, a paid-off house, no more of that anxiety every time the credit card statement closes. Maybe even stepping back from work a little earlier than planned. $1 million. The number the entire culture uses as shorthand for making it. Movies, music, sayings, all pointing at the same round symbolic target. There's a problem, though, and it's not a small one. You're aiming at a target that no longer represents what you think it represents. And here's the harder part. Even the people who've already hit that target, who today officially have a net worth of $1 million or more, most of them don't feel anywhere close to rich. Let's understand why being a millionaire today is completely different from what the word still implies, and what that changes for anyone chasing that number. Start with the simplest possible question. How much money does someone need to be considered rich? According to the most recent Charles Schwab Modern Wealth Survey, conducted in 2025 with 2,000 Americans between the ages of 21 and 75, the average answer was $2,300,000. Not a million. $2,300,000. That number actually dropped slightly from the year before, when it sat at $2,500,000, but it's still 21% higher than it was back in 2021, when the same question produced an answer of $1,900,000. In other words, the bar society itself uses to define wealth has climbed faster than most people can climb along with it. And here's the first break in the illusion. $1 million, that iconic number, the literal thing the word millionaire describes, doesn't come close today to putting someone in the top 10% of American households. To land in that group today requires a net worth of at least $1,800,000, or an annual income of $210,000. Being a millionaire in the literal sense of the word today is a comfortable position, but it's structurally below the line that financial culture actually considers elite. If this helped you see something you'd never stop to calculate, subscribe, because that's exactly what we do here. Take everyday financial decisions and goals and show you what they actually represent. Now, before we go further, here's something important to understand. When you think about becoming a millionaire, you're not picturing an amount of cash sitting in a vault. Without realizing it, you're signing a silent contract full of assumptions about liquidity, about time, and about lifestyle. Assumptions that almost never match the reality of the people who actually get there. Let's break this down piece by piece. The first assumption is that net worth means available money. It doesn't. According to Federal Reserve data and recent breakdowns of American wealth composition, roughly 90% of American millionaires hold real estate as a meaningful part of their net worth. That includes the home they live in. And the value of a home, while it counts entirely toward how much you're worth on paper, isn't money you can spend tomorrow without selling the roof over your own head or borrowing against it. The second assumption is that getting there happened fast, or will happen fast. That's not what the numbers show. The average age of someone becoming a millionaire for the first time in the United States, according to Ramsey Solutions research surveying more than 10,000 millionaires, is 49 years old. And when you look at the entire pool of millionaires today, not just the ones who just arrived, the average age climbs to 61. Nearly 3/4 of all American millionaires are 50 or older. The road to that number, for almost anyone who didn't inherit it or win the lottery, took decades of work, saving, and above all, enough time in the market for invested money to actually do the heavy lifting. The third assumption, maybe the most important of all, that hitting the number means stopping. About 58% of American millionaires are self-employed or business owners, according to that same Ramsey research. That means a huge slice of this group isn't lying in a hammock somewhere. Many of them are working harder than a typical salaried employee because a large part of their own net worth is tied to a business that still has to be run. Now let's talk about what it actually costs to get there and how long it ties you up. If the average path to that first million Takes something close to 32 years of consistent financial discipline, according to analyses combining Federal Reserve data with lifetime wealth accumulation patterns. That means the typical person is trading 3 entire decades of present-day spending for future accumulation. That's not a price that shows up all at once, like a tag in a store. It's a price paid month after month, year after year, in a repeated decision to spend less than you earn and invest the difference, sustained by enough time for compound interest to finally do the heavy work. And here's the first number that changes the whole equation. The purchasing power of that million isn't fixed. It erodes. $1 million in 1990 had purchasing power equivalent to more than $2,300,000 today, accounting for accumulated inflation over that period. In other words, the same label, $1 million, meant, a little over 3 decades ago, something close to double what it means today. The word didn't change. What it buys changed drastically. And that's exactly why the cultural perception of how much is rich was forced upward, even though most people still carry the old reference value in their heads. This is the sticker price not being the real cost. You can accumulate exactly $1 million and still have reached a real standard of living lower than what the same amount bought the generation before you. But we still haven't factored in the part almost nobody calculates before aiming for this number: the gap between paper net worth and money that actually solves day-to-day problems. Take the average American millionaire's net worth today, somewhere around $2,200,000, according to recent Schwab data. A large slice of that total sits in real estate. Another meaningful chunk sits in retirement accounts, which carry penalties for early withdrawal before age 59 and a half. And another portion might be tied up in ownership of a business, which only becomes real money if and when that business gets sold. What's left is genuinely liquid capital, ready to be used without creating new debt or a taxable event. Tends to be a much smaller fraction of the advertised total. This is where most people get the mental math wrong. They picture $1 million as a pile of cash in a checking account. In practice, for almost every real millionaire, it's a mosaic of partially locked assets, each with its own rule about when and how it can turn into cash in hand. Let's do this math in human terms, because it isn't abstract. Imagine someone who reaches a net worth of $1 million at age 50. That looks like a win, and in many ways it is. But if $600,000 of that total sits in a retirement account with a withdrawal penalty before 59 and a half, and another $250,000 is the value of the primary home, that leaves only $150,000 of genuinely free capital for emergencies, opportunities, or any of life's surprises. $150,000 is a solid cushion, but it's a long way from the total freedom feeling that the millionaire label promises in the popular imagination. Now expand that same logic. The closer someone is to the real average American wealth composition, 90% involving real estate, a large share in retirement accounts, the smaller the truly liquid slice of the total they're carrying around. There's also a second layer to this, an even stranger one. Even among people who already feel rich, the real number tends to be much smaller than the target the same person would set for someone else. According to earlier Schwab research, about 48% of Americans surveyed said they already feel financially rich today in their real lived life. Yet the average net worth of that specific group, the group that reports already feeling rich, was approximately $560,000, less than a quarter of the value the same survey points to as the objective bar for wealth when the question is about people in general. There's a clear psychological reason for that gap. When the question is about ourselves, we tend to compare our present to our own past, and any relative improvement already triggers a sense of progress and security. When the question is about how much is wealth in the abstract, we compare against the top of what we see socially, usually inflated by social media, news about billionaires, and a luxury consumption standard that sits far above the statistical reality of the vast majority of the population. Two completely different rulers applied to the same word. That creates a contrast worth holding on to. You see the number you supposedly need to feel secure according to everyone else, but you don't see that the real security people actually report feeling in their own lives tends to arrive well before that. It's also worth separating two different tiers that the Schwab survey itself distinguishes because they aren't the same thing, and mixing them up is another common mental miscalculation. There's the financially comfortable tier, which the 2025 survey sets at $839,000, a figure that rose by $61,000 compared to the year before. And there's the wealthy tier, at that same $2,300,000. The gap between those two numbers is almost $1.5 million, and in practice it represents the difference between no longer worrying about everyday bills and actually entering the category financial culture recognizes as elite. Most people who feel well off today are statistically in the first tier, not the second. And that's exactly where part of the confusion about what being a millionaire should provide comes from. And that bar isn't the same for everyone. The same Schwab survey breaks the numbers down by generation, and the difference is revealing. Gen Z, the youngest respondents in the sample, set the wealth threshold at $1,700,000, and the comfort threshold at just $329,000. Millennials and Gen X converge around $2,100,000 for wealth. Baby boomers, the oldest generation in the survey, require $2,800,000 to consider someone rich, the highest figure among any age group. According to the researchers themselves, this reflects how each generation experienced the economy differently. Boomers tend to associate wealth with accumulated asset security, property, and inheritance, while younger generations, who've already lived through multiple financial crises, tend to value freedom from debt and experiences more than one specific round number. Now let's scale this story beyond a single individual. There are somewhere between 22 and 24 million millionaires in the United States today, depending on the exact methodology used by different research institutes, which represents somewhere between 8 and 9% of the American adult population. Together, this group controls more than $90 trillion in net worth, equivalent to more than 70% of all household wealth in the country. In other words, fewer than 1 in 10 adults holds the overwhelming majority of the nation's wealth. And even so, a huge share of that same group doesn't feel anywhere close to rich, according to the very cultural yardstick in place today. Multiply that across the economy as a whole, and you understand why practically the entire investment, financial planning, luxury real estate, and high-end product industry is built exactly on top of that gap between the number someone already has and the number culture keeps promising as the real bar. That gap never closes on its own. Structurally, it's the engine behind a huge share of status consumption in the entire country. It's also worth comparing this group to the rest of the population to understand the real scale of concentration involved. The median net worth of a typical American family sits somewhere around $200,000 to $250,000, according to aggregated recent consumer research data. That puts the average millionaire's net worth, that $2,200,000 figure, at almost 10 times the national median. And among the bottom 50% of the American population, the wealth share controlled by that entire group adds up to only 2 to 3% of the country's total net worth. The gap between having $1 million and having the national average is already enormous. The gap between having $1 million and the other end of the pyramid is almost incalculable in proportional terms. But let's move past the aggregate statistics and look inside the actual composition of wealth, because that's where the variable that most determines whether someone feels wealthy or not really lives. The main variable isn't total net worth. It's the ratio between available liquid capital and locked-up capital. Two people can have exactly $1 million in net worth and live completely different emotional realities. One might have $800,000 locked in real estate and retirement accounts, with only $200,000 in liquid reserve. The other might have $400,000 in real estate and retirement, and $600,000 available in easily accessible liquid investments. On paper, the same number. In real life, completely different levels of financial stress. The second relevant variable is the source of the wealth. People who built their net worth through their own business, more than half of all American millionaires, according to Ramsey, generally carry an ongoing dependence on that business continuing to run, which means a large part of that net worth only becomes real on the day the company actually sells, and until then, it lives with the same cash flow instability any other entrepreneur faces. The third variable is the age at which someone reaches that net worth. Someone who hits $1 million invested at 35 has, mathematically, decades of compound growth still ahead of them, which completely changes that money's future trajectory. Someone who hits the same number at 65, on the eve of retirement, is in a preservation phase, not a growth phase, and that same amount needs to last much longer without the same margin for recovering from a mistake. It's worth running this math in very concrete terms, because the effect of time here isn't subtle. It's the single heaviest factor in this entire equation. $1 million invested at a historical average market return of roughly 7% a year, already adjusted for inflation, roughly doubles in real value every 10 years or so. That means the same amount, left untouched, is worth close to $2 million in real terms after a decade, and close to $4 million after 2 decades. Someone who reaches that first million at 35 and manages to leave most of it invested untouched is, statistically, on track for a far larger real net worth by 55. Someone who reaches that same first million at 60 simply doesn't have that same time horizon working in their favor anymore, and often needs to start withdrawing part of it right at the exact phase when it should still be compounding. The arrival number is identical. The future outcome has nothing to do with the other. Now for 3 concrete scenarios, to make this sensitivity really clear. In the good scenario, someone starts investing consistently while still in their 20s, prioritizes liquid assets like stocks and investment funds instead of concentrating everything in real estate, and reaches that first million in net worth around age 45, with a healthy proportion of available capital. This person still has, potentially, another 20 years of compound growth working in their favor before needing to withdraw anything to live on, and their sense of security tends to be proportional to reality because liquidity keeps pace with the number on paper. In the realistic scenario, which reflects the average shown by the data itself, the person reaches that first million around age 49, with a large share concentrated between a primary home and retirement accounts, and a much more modest liquid reserve than the total suggests. They are technically a millionaire, but they live with a real sense of tightness whenever something unexpected comes up that would require touching locked-up assets. Exactly the pattern that explains why so many real millionaires don't feel rich. In the bad scenario, someone concentrates most of their net worth in a single asset, usually their own business or a property inflated in value in one specific area, without diversification. In this case, the $1 million on paper depends entirely on a market valuation that can shift quickly, whether from a downturn in that business's industry or a correction in the local real estate market. The feeling of wealth disappears along with the next downturn, even without any formal loss ever being realized, simply because that asset's reference value dropped on paper. The difference between these 3 scenarios isn't the final number. It's the structure behind it, and how much that structure was thought through before someone spent decades chasing a number without examining what it's actually made of. There's also a rarely discussed side effect of this whole moving target game. 63% of Americans surveyed in the 2025 Schwab study said it feels like it takes more money today to be considered rich than it did a year ago, citing inflation, a tighter economy, and and higher taxes as the main reasons. In other words, the bar doesn't just rise because of social comparison. It rises because the lived experience of the cost of living really is getting more expensive faster than most people can accumulate new net worth. It's a target moving away in two directions at once: inflation eroding the purchasing power of what you already have, and collective perception inflating what it would take to win the game. That also explains why the ratio between total net worth and liquid capital has become a far more important variable than it was a generation ago. When the cost of living rises faster than the average salary, the slice of net worth locked in illiquid assets, real estate, retirement accounts, business ownership, stops being a technical detail and becomes the difference between getting through a tough year comfortably or having to reach for expensive credit right when you can least afford high interest. Now, I want to know your take. Knowing that being a millionaire today sits statistically below the top 10%, and that a large share of that net worth tends to be locked in real estate and retirement accounts, do you think $1 million should still be treated as the great cultural marker of financial success? Or should that symbol have already been replaced by a different reference point? Back to the scene we opened with. You, lying in bed, running the math that $1 million would fix everything. Now you know that number, on its own, carries no guarantee. It can mean real freedom if it's well structured and spread across liquid assets, built early enough to let time work in its favor. Or it can mean exactly the same financial tightness you feel today, just with a bigger number printed on a statement, mostly locked in a house you're not selling, and an account you can't touch for a few more years. The real goal was never the $1 million label. It was always the ratio between what you accumulate and what's actually available to give you choice, time, and less anxiety day to day. And that difference explains exactly why so many people hit the number and still feel the same way they did before they got there. If this video changed how you think about your own financial target, hit subscribe, because that's exactly the kind of shift in perspective we're after here every week.